Today, we're going to take a look at implementing Sentry error reporting into a Next.js application. Now, in my opinion, Sentry is absolutely mandatory for any UI-based applications today, thanks to all the amazing features it gives us around capturing errors and displaying those errors back to developers who can actually see them, debug them easily thanks to the many tools that Sentry offers us, and allow us to actually handle these errors more appropriately other than just sitting inside of the user's console. So we're going to dive into all these excellent features that Sentry offers us to debug errors, and I'm going to show you step by step how to set up Sentry in a new Next.js application. We're going to dive into the details of what Sentry actually does in our Next.js app and how it works underneath the hood, so you have a great understanding of how to set it up and really utilize it to empower your UI applications and capture errors more gracefully and deal with them really quickly as they occur in real time. So I'm really excited to jump into the video. Let's go ahead and I'll see you there. I just want to let you know that I now have all 3 of my best-selling courses on my membership website, which means you get full access to all 3 of these courses, as well as a monthly exclusive members-only lecture where I dive into extremely deep detail on a particular topic that you have asked for. And all of these exclusive member lectures you get access to, as well as all the courses for a low price of $2.99. So if you're interested in getting more exclusive content and checking out one of these courses, I highly recommend checking out a membership on my site. Thank you so much for the support. I'll of course leave a link below where you can check it out. Thanks so much and enjoy the video. All right, so let's go ahead and get started by initializing a new Next.js application. To do this, we can take advantage of npx, which has a create next app command, and I'll use @latest here to use the latest version available. So go ahead and proceed, and we can call this whatever we'd like. I'll call this Next.js Sentry, and let's go ahead and stick with all the defaults that it's suggesting to use out of the box. And I'll go ahead and after entering the defaults for all of these suggestions, I'll go ahead and wait until npx finishes bootstrapping our Next.js app. Okay, so with our app initialized and our dependencies installed, we can now cd into the application folder, and we can go ahead and open it up in a code editor. So I've gone ahead and opened up our app, and we have our default Next.js application here with the app directory approach, where we have our layout.tsx bootstrapping our application, and the page.tsx here, which is acting as our root home component right now. So let's go ahead and start up this application so we can see it running properly. I'll go ahead and run npm run dev to start our Next.js development server. Now we can open it up at localhost 3000 and see our starter Next.js template here from our layout.tsx. So now that our application is initialized, let's go ahead and see how we add Sentry error reporting to it so that we can automatically catch any exceptions and report them to a common dashboard where we can view and actually action those errors. So our first step is going to be to make sure we actually have a Sentry account. So go ahead and open up your browser and go to sentry.io, where we can go ahead and get started by creating a new free account. So again, the great thing about Sentry to get started, it's completely free. There's no credit card needed. Simply go ahead and click Get Started and create an account so that you can start integrating it with your Next.js application. All right, so after we created our account, we're brought to a dashboard here where we can click Start to install Sentry. So let's go ahead and click this, and then we can search for the actual platform that we're using. So we'll go ahead and select our platform here as Next.js and click Configure SDK. And now we can see instructions to configure the Next.js SDK with Sentry. And they actually have a wizard that's going to walk through all the steps necessary to set up our Next.js application to Sentry to set up this automated error reporting. Now we're going to walk through all of these things that Sentry is doing in our application. Let's go ahead and start by just running the wizard firstly. So back in our terminal, I'll stop our application and paste in this Sentry wizard command. Go ahead and proceed to install the Sentry wizard. We'll go ahead and select that we're using Sentry SaaS, and we have a Sentry account. So go ahead and select yes. This will take you to a new browser window to go ahead and log into your Sentry account. So go ahead and now log into your Sentry account. All right, so I just logged into my Sentry account, and now back in the wizard here, we can actually see the Sentry application that it creates for us by default. So I'll go ahead and select this application, and this is going to go ahead and install the Sentry Next.js library, which is going to actually contain the code that our app will utilize to send our errors to Sentry. Now we also have this option here to route Sentry requests in the browser through our Next.js server. And this is to actually get around some issues with reporting Sentry errors and ad blockers. So by sending the request to our server, we can bypass these client-side ad blockers and any potential issues with sending our errors to Sentry. So I'll go ahead and select yes. Now note, this can increase our server load as well as the hosting bill. So just keep that in mind if you go with this option. We'll also go ahead and select the yes to create a example page where we're going to have a simulated error button that's going to allow us to test our Sentry setup. So go ahead and select yes. We're not going to select any CI/CD tool because we're building our application manually. And now we can see the wizard has completed and connected Sentry to our app. Let's go ahead and rerun our development server. And now if we go back to our application, we can go to /Sentry example page, which is the example page that Sentry created for us. Again, we're going to walk through all of the changes that has occurred in our Next.js app. Let's just go ahead and test out this setup to make sure our connection to Sentry is working. And to do this, again, the Sentry error page is rendering this test error button where the callback function here will actually throw an error, and that will be automatically sent to Sentry. So let's check this out by clicking the throw error button. We can immediately see Next.js error in the bottom left with this example error here. So this is exactly what we'd expect. So let's go ahead and now go back to our Sentry application where we can actually see that the bottom here that it has received an error, and we can click take me to my error to actually dive into the details of it. So we're actually brought to the Sentry dashboard now. And this is a lot to take in at first. Let's go ahead and just click back on the project section, which is essentially the home page for all of the projects we have inside of our Sentry organization. This is the Next.js Sentry application that we've just created and generated an error for. So we can click on it and see any number of issues that have occurred over periods of time that we can filter for. So we can actually see a couple of errors that have been reported here from our button click. One of these is on the front end and one's on the back end. So before we dive deeper into how Sentry is reporting these errors and how we can actually take advantage of all the great features Sentry offers, let's go back to our Next.js application and dive into a bit to see what this wizard has actually done to connect our app to Sentry so we have a better understanding of how it's working underneath the hood. So we can actually see we have a new API route from Next.js here inside API folder. And this default Next.js server route here, a get route that we're exposing, is where we're actually throwing an example of API route error in our Next.js backend. So both our Next.js UI and the server side are both handling errors with Sentry and reporting errors to our Sentry dashboard. So we're simply throwing this dummy error here and sending back a response. In this route, we can also see the Sentry example page component, which we've already navigated to, and we can see the JSX here for our example button. So if we look at the onClick function for this error button, we see we're actually calling this Sentry import. So we're importing Sentry from Sentry Next.js. And when we click the button, we're calling start span on it. Now a span in Sentry is essentially just a period or a timed interval of application events that have a start and end time. So by creating the span here, we can tell Sentry that we're beginning some sort of transaction, or in this case, a request to our backend, which can be really useful for digging into these errors later on because Sentry is configured both for our Next.js UI and server. By starting the span here on the client, we can follow this request all the way through from here to the server API route where we throw this error, and we will be able to see this later on when we dig deeper into the Sentry error, where we can actually follow this span in its entirety and get a really good view of the whole request, which makes digging into the underlying error a lot easier. So we can see here we're calling that dummy API route, which we know throws an error. So we're throwing an error both in the API, and then we're also then throwing this client-side error here because the response isn't okay. So we're throwing two errors in this span, which we'll dig into in a bit. Let's go ahead and also look at this global error handler that Sentry has added here. Now, this global error file is a special file in Next.js. It's the least granular error UI we can create, and it's considered the catch-all error handling for our whole application. So we can have more fine-grained error handling components that handle specific routes, for example. However, if none other are defined, then we will reach this global error handler where we have some actual error handle logic here in this use effect hook. So whenever this error handler gets triggered, which is going to be in any case where we throw an uncaught error in our Next.js app, then Sentry is going to catch that error here and report it by calling sentry.captureException, which will capture the exception and send it to Sentry. Now we know this is going to run every time there is a new error. So that means we're going to catch all uncaught errors and send them to Sentry, which is great. And then here is just the rest of this error handler component JSX, which renders our actual HTML as well as the next error component. So these are the files that Next.js Sentry has added to our app directory. We can take a closer look at these files at the root. So the first one here will be Instrumentation.ts. Now again, this is a special file type in Next.js that it will automatically look for at runtime to apply certain instrumentations, which is how we can apply monitoring and logging tools into our app with Next.js out of the box, which is super useful. So we have a check here that Sentry has added to see whether or not we're running on Node.js or on the edge here, which are two separate Next.js runtimes, depending if we're on the server here or on Next.js edge here. Now these are going to import two separate config files, and again these are at the root here, the final three files that Sentry has added, and these are where we're actually initializing Sentry in our application. So we're going to be calling these configuration files, which are actually going to be initializing Sentry and configuring a number of options here. So the first one here, the DSN, is the actual address to our Sentry server and the application. Again, the wizard has automatically applied this for us, so this will be different for you depending on your application identifier. We then have a number of options we can configure on a Sentry application to configure the error reporting logic. So for example, we have sampling rates here, replay session sample rate, and replay on error sample rate. So these are all separate options that can configure how frequently we want to sample our application for errors, and also use things like replays, which allow us to rewatch errors after they've happened in real time. So we can actually see that replay integration has been added here into this integrations property, where we're actually configuring it to block all media and mask all text, so that when Sentry actually replays the error that happened in real time to us on the Sentry dashboard, it's going to make sure to obscure any sensitive data, which is really useful. So I'll be sure to leave a link to the Sentry docs where you can learn more about these options and all of the other options available to configure Sentry further. However, these defaults out of the box are going to work great in our case, so let's leave them as is. Now notice the edge and server configurations don't have any session replay configuration because they're going to be on the server. There's going to be no DOM to replay. So that's why we have separate configurations depending on the runtime. Now finally, I want to show you the nextconfig.js here was actually modified with this new mix-in here with Sentry config. So this is a default Sentry config combined with Next.js to give us the options that we want to integrate Next.js and Sentry together automatically. So in addition to providing our next config here, which right now is just an empty object, we also specify different options to this Sentry Webpack plugin. So Sentry Webpack plugin is going to take care of uploading our application source maps to Sentry automatically, which means that when we view error traces in Sentry later on, we're going to be able to view exactly where in our code the errors are originating from, which is an extremely useful feature of Sentry, especially with this Next.js Webpack plugin. This happens all automatically without us having to do anything. We of course just need to point it at the correct organization and project in Sentry that we want to send these source maps to, and we can go ahead and configure the source maps generation further if we like. We'll just leave everything as is. Now, one final thing to note here is that this next config.js, this with Sentry config here, is going to actually utilize this .env.sentry build plugin script when it actually runs and uploads our source maps to Sentry, and that's because we've actually export a Sentry auth token here, which is essentially the password to be able to authenticate with our Sentry account and make sure we can upload these source maps because we're an authenticated user. So of course, by default, this is not committed to Git because our git ignore gets updated thanks to the Sentry wizard. So make sure this stays as is and you don't commit this file, since this is your Sentry password and will authenticate your application to Sentry to be able to upload source maps. So with our Sentry configuration all set up and the connection working as expected, thanks to the Sentry wizard, let's go ahead and dive deeper into Sentry dashboard here to explore these sample errors and see how we can actually evaluate them and action them very easily. All right, so let's head back to Sentry and take a closer look at the errors that we've caught in our project with our example error component. So at this UI here, as we've seen before, we can have our projects here where we can have each project, which could be separate applications in our organization, displayed here as projects. Or if we prefer to just view all the current errors being reported, we can click on this Issues tab here where we can see all of the current errors that have been unhandled. So let's go ahead and dive in first to our Sentry example front-end error. So if we click here, we can immediately see it's part of our Next.js application project. And if we scroll down to event highlights, we already start to get some very useful information, including the environment that this occurred in, whether or not this was a development or production build, as well as the URL that it occurred in. We get some browser information here, including the fact that we're using Chrome and the user's IP and browser information. Now, if we scroll down a bit more, we can actually see, thanks to our source map uploads from the Sentry Webpack plugin, exactly where in our code that this error was thrown. So we can see the exact file name and the exact line number, the line of code that actually threw this error. So this is extremely helpful when debugging errors that have occurred in production. We can even see the function name here, all given to us by default, which is really helpful thanks to our source map upload. Now the next bit here I think is some of the most useful components of Sentry, and that's the session replay that we get access to. So when Sentry is running in our application, it's actually recording any events that occur in the DOM around when an error has occurred, and can send those events directly to our Sentry error here, so that these DOM events can actually be replayed back and we can see exactly how the user interacted with our app to trigger the error. Of course, we've also configured Sentry replays to mask any text or images to ensure we have no problems leaking sensitive data. So we can actually go in full screen here, go ahead and play, and this is actually going to play back what the user did to trigger the event, and we can actually see the DOM elements here on this right sidebar. So the user clicked on this button DOM element to trigger the error. So this is incredibly helpful, as you can imagine, when debugging errors, to see how our users are actually using the system and triggering errors. Finally, if we scroll down, we can see we get access to breadcrumbs, which essentially are just these DOM events that occurred, as well as some network information. So we can see what happened around the error, including the first event recorded here was a navigation to this example page. We began a Sentry transaction, clicked on our button, sent a fetch request to our backend inside of the span, which actually has a link to a span here, so we can open this up in a new tab and dig into this span a bit more. And then finally, we have the front end error. So because we opened up this transaction in a span in our code, we actually get access to it in more details. So we'll dig into this span in a bit. Let's leave this open while we finish looking through the rest of the error details. Now finally, at the bottom of this page, we get more details about the headers, the actual user's environment, where they made this request from. So this is again super helpful to debug some of these errors that may be environmental. So we get all this great information when errors occur on our UI now, which is excellent. Let's take a closer look here at this trace that we've actually been able to create thanks to the span we created. Now we notice that this trace here is actually inside of this performance tab. We can always go back to traces here and look for traces, in my case, the last 7 days. So this is one of these traces that occurred. And this is actually measuring performance of our application. So we can actually measure the time it took to render our component tree, build the component tree, make requests, and we can actually debug our application for sensitive areas where we think things are slowing down and get an excellent view on the performance of that area. All we have to do is wrap it in a span in our application. So again, we can click on this span here and it takes us back to this performance tab where we get a more general view of performance, including some more detailed metrics around our users interacting with our app. So this is a whole nother great benefit to Sentry is the performance metrics it gives you. We're actually measuring how long it takes to navigate between pages and render our data to our users. And we can keep track of that information here in the performance page, which is extremely useful. Now I want to go back to our error here. So our front end error, if we click on this here and go back down to our example front end span, we can actually see again this trace here that we began and all the details around it. And we can actually see here that this trace is reporting 2 errors inside of the span. And that's because, of course, we started this span, sent the request to our Next.js backend where we threw another error and ultimately threw that error again on the client side. So we're actually able to record both of these errors in this single span and see it here as the request actually sent to the backend. So we can see we sent the request, a GET request, to our Sentry example API. On the server here, this is where the error occurred. We actually get this error notification here. So after 4 milliseconds, the server threw an error, and we can see that error then populate back here to the other client side, and we even get the stack trace here as well. So thanks to wrapping everything in a span, we can actually see the entire length of this whole transaction, how long it took, and where the errors did occur, which make it really useful if there's some area in our code that has some errors and we're trying to figure out what is occurring, or if we have some sort of performance related issues, we can always just wrap them in a span and get these really detailed metrics around how long the entire span took. And that's thanks to these traces here. So we have all this great information that Sentry gives us. I hope you've learned a lot and will use Sentry in your next application to monitor errors on the UI, where typically it's been a lot more difficult to actually capture errors because it's of course on the user's client side. Well, thanks to Sentry, we can actually get these detailed information and stack traces about any errors that occur and make sure that we're handling them appropriately thanks to Sentry error reporting. So thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.